On May 14, 1983, at 1:10 in the morning. 2. California Highway Patrol officers notice a brown Toyota Celica drifting unpredictably across the glowing asphalt of Interstate 5 in Orange County. The officers activate their sirens, pulling the driver over onto the dark shoulder of the freeway for suspected drunk driving. The driver, 38-year-old Randy Krath, steps out into the crisp night air, discards an empty beer bottle into the brush, and fails a standard field sobriety test. While one officer administers the test, his partner shines a heavy flashlight through the passenger side window of the vehicle. The beam illuminates a young Marine slumped against the door panel. His face half hidden by a dark jacket, the young man lacks a pulse, and a faint dark impression sits visibly across his neck. What began as a standard traffic intervention instantly transforms into an active, horrifying crime scene. The patrol officers secure the driver on the spot, entirely unaware they have just apprehended one of the most prolific and elusive predators in American history. In the early 1970s, the rapidly expanding freeway system of Southern California served as a bustling artery of youth culture and boundless optimism. Endless ribbons of sun-baked concrete connected quiet suburban tracts to the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. During this era, hitchhiking stood as a common and socially accepted mode of transit for the region's youth. Young men, off-duty Marines stationed at nearby Camp Pendleton, and local teenagers stood along the interstate on ramps. They navigated the world with their thumbs out, seeking a quick ride to the beach or a straightforward trip back home to their families. The heavy hum of cicadas and the persistent drone of passing engines formed the soundtrack of their daily routines. The wider community felt secure, oblivious to the unique vulnerabilities created by this transient highway culture. Families trusted the unspoken social contract of the era, believing that strangers pulling over to offer a lift meant no harm. These trusting travelers carried surfboards, duffel bags, and vibrant futures, leaving their homes with absolute certainty they would return for dinner. They possessed a deep sense of optimism, riding the coastal winds without a single thought of danger. These missing travelers were beloved sons, devoted brothers, and aspiring servicemen woven into the fabric of their communities. They adhered to distinct daily routines, writing letters to their mothers back in the Midwest or saving their military paychecks to purchase their first cars. When the weekend arrived, young Marines shed their rigid uniforms, slipped into casual clothes, and embraced the freedom of the California coastline. They played football on the sandy shores, shared meals at local diners, and planned ambitious lives beyond their military service. Their families relied on them, expecting regular phone calls and holiday visits. They possessed no reason to fear the well-dressed drivers who offered them a comfortable seat and a cold beverage from a cooler. The heavy metallic click of a passenger door shutting represented the beginning of an adventure rather than the end of a lifetime. The prevailing innocence of the decade shielded these young men from recognizing the cold malice operating on the very roads they traveled daily. They simply climbed into passenger seats, eager to reach their destinations, unaware of the grim fate awaiting them. Among the countless drivers blending into this sun-drenched landscape was Randy Krath, an intelligent computer consultant who projected an aura of absolute normalcy. Kraft lived a quiet suburban lifestyle, maintaining a lucrative career that demanded frequent travel across state lines. He resided in a well-kept neighborhood, manicured lawns and pilling paint on older houses forming the backdrop of his daily existence. Neighbors viewed him as a mild-mannered professional, a man who paid his taxes, maintained steady employment, and possessed no glaring red flags. He wore neat slacks, drove a well-maintained vehicle, and engaged in polite conversation with the people he encountered at local businesses. Behind this polished professional facade, however, he harbored a dark compulsion that would soon exploit the trusting nature of the region's young hitchhikers. Kraft possessed a chilling ability to compartmentalize his life, operating sophisticated computer systems by day and prowling the desolate stretches of Interstate 5 by night. He understood the exact geography of the freeways, mapping out the precise distances between isolated on-ramps and desolate ravines. He weaponized his harmless appearance, using his clean-cut aesthetic to disarm the instincts of cautious travelers. This veneer of respectability granted him invisible access to his targets, allowing a sophisticated predator to hide in plain sight. The silent terror officially commenced in the early 1970s when young men began vanishing without a trace from the gravel shoulders of California highways. Initially, local law enforcement treated these disappearances as isolated incidents, attributing them to runaway teenagers or soldiers going absent without leave. The staggering distance between the jurisdictions of Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego counties created vast geographical blind spots for investigators. Police departments operated in silos, failing to communicate missing persons reports across county lines due to rigid, outdated administrative protocols. Paperwork piled up on different desks in different cities, preventing any single detective from recognizing the escalating crisis. Families plunged into an agonizing state of uncertainty, plastering utility poles with faded photographs of their missing sons. The missing men left behind abandoned plans, uncashed paychecks, and empty beds tearing at the psychological fabric of their homes. Loved ones paced the floors of their living rooms, waiting for a phone call that would never come. This administrative disconnect allowed the predator to establish a consistent hunting routine without triggering a unified police response. The disappearance and subsequent discovery of Wayne Duquette in late 1971 marked a grim turning point in the scattered investigations. Duquette, a 21-year-old bartender, vanished after leaving his workplace in Long Beach, stepping out into the neon glow of the city streets. Months later, authorities made a chilling realization when they located him discarded in a rugged ravine off the Ortega Highway. This desolate stretch of road wound through the steep, shadow-filled canyons of the Santa Ana Mountains, miles away from his last known location. Medical examiners analyzing the scene began noticing a disturbing, consistent pattern among the victims recovered along the freeway corridors over the following months. They documented specific ligatures, distinct binding methods, and the systematic removal of personal identification from the scenes. The physical evidence indicated a meticulous offender who took calculated steps to delay the identification process and frustrate forensic teams. Investigators stood at the edge of steep embankments, looking down at the dense brush, realizing these secluded drop sites were chosen with terrifying precision. The sheer vastness of the sprawling highway system transformed from a symbol of freedom into a sprawling hunting ground. The true sophistication of the crimes revealed itself deep within the sterile walls of the county medical examiner offices. Forensic pathologists running extensive toxicology reports uncovered an exact chemical signature linking the disparate cases together. The lab results revealed that the victims were intoxicated with specific combinations of alcohol and potent prescription sedatives before their demise. Medical personnel found overwhelming concentrations of medications like Valium and Ativan circulating in the systems of the recovered men. This distinct toxicological cocktail pointed directly to a calculated, methodical predator rather than a perpetrator committing crimes of spontaneous opportunity. The offender utilized these sedatives to render physically fit. Military-trained young men incapacitated without initiating a physical struggle. Law enforcement realized with chilling clarity that the missing men never stood a chance against an invisible chemical assault. Detectives stared at the mounting stack of coroner reports, connecting the dots between the missing Marines and the fatal doses of prescription drugs. They recognized that they were hunting an organized individual who utilized pharmaceutical knowledge to execute his grim agenda. The stark reality settled over the task forces as they understood a single, intelligent serial offender was operating unchecked across Southern California. As 1973 unfolded, the investigation into the vanishing men transformed into a vast logistical nightmare for Southern California authorities. Detectives from Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego counties found themselves staring at sprawling topographical maps pinned to precinct walls. The geographic distances between the abduction sites and the rugged drop zone stretched for dozens of miles across intersecting highway jurisdictions. Every time a highway patrol officer located another victim discarded off the interstate shoulder, a rigid protocol dictated the immediate transfer of evidence to a different local agency. This strict bureaucratic division created insurmountable barriers for evidence sharing among the eager task forces. A detective working in a Long Beach precinct possessed no authorization to access case files from a neighboring station in Santa Ana, just 20 miles away. Valium-laced toxicology reports remained buried inside isolated manila folders, gathering dust in separate county morgues. Task force commanders attempted to manually duplicate carbon copy records to bridge the gap, but the sheer volume of paperwork overwhelmed the understaffed departments. Day after day, investigators waited for postal deliveries of critical forensic files, losing invaluable time while the predator continued his highway patrols. Law enforcement agencies unknowingly chased fragmented pieces of a much larger puzzle. Detectives spent their days tracking down useless alibis and interviewing uncooperative associates of the victims, entirely missing the organized nature of the highway abductions. The rigid administrative protocols effectively granted the unidentified offender a massive operational blind spot. By the mid-1970s, detectives encountered a historically unprecedented forensic anomaly that derailed the investigation entirely. 3 distinct, highly active serial predators operated simultaneously along the exact same Southern California freeway corridors. William Bonin, Patrick Kearney, and Randy Kraft utilized identical on-ramps to scout the same vulnerable population of hitchhikers and young servicemen when search teams located victims left in the dense brush of the Santa Monica Mountains or the steep ravines of Orange County. The crime scenes blurred together. Authorities fundamentally failed to separate the distinct signatures of the 3 separate offenders. Police profilers grouped entirely unrelated cases into a single master file, creating a deeply flawed composite sketch of the suspect. This massive conflation of victims resulted in a catastrophic dead end for the Joint Task Forces. Detectives drafted behavioral profiles based on the chaotic actions of Bonin and the distinct disposal methods of Kearney, blinding themselves to Kraft and his specific chemical signatures. Field agents spent countless hours staking out local bars and highway rest stops, looking for a violent, disorganized transient that matched their inaccurate profile. They ignored the possibility of a meticulous, employed professional orchestrating a significant portion of these disappearances. The presence of 3 simultaneous predators masked the specific trail of the prescription sedatives. Kraft capitalized on this investigative chaos, maintaining his invisible routine while police chased a phantom composite that did not exist in reality. While frustrated detectives sifted through thousands of mismatched tips, Randy Kraft lived comfortably inside his quiet Long Beach home. He maintained a lucrative career as a freelance computer programmer, earning the respect of his colleagues and the trust of his corporate clients. His professional expertise required regular company-funded travel to install complex digital networks across the country. Kraft utilized these legitimate business trips to expand his hunting grounds far beyond the borders of California. He boarded commercial flights with his clean-cut appearance and a neatly packed briefcase, projecting an image of total corporate reliability. Upon landing at airports in states like Oregon and Michigan, he rented vehicles and immediately sought out the local highway systems. The geography shifted from the sun-baked concrete of the Pacific coast to the damp pine forests of the Pacific Northwest and the cold industrial roads of the Midwest. Despite the changing environments, Frath applied the exact same methodical approach to his targets. He offered rides to local youths navigating unfamiliar stretches of road, engaging them in polite conversation to lower their defenses. Once inside the confines of his rental car, he offered them beverages, heavily laced with his signature cocktail of Atavan and Valium. He left local authorities in these new jurisdictions completely baffled by the sudden appearance of unidentified individuals exhibiting highly specific chemical combinations. The expansion of his territory stretched the already thin resources of law enforcement, creating isolated crime scenes thousands of miles apart. Back in California, forensic technicians faced an agonizing lack of physical evidence at the local drop sites. Crime scene investigators combed the steep embankments of Interstate 5 on their hands and knees, searching for tire tracks or stray fibers. The harsh coastal winds and heavy evening fog routinely swept the outdoor locations clean before morning commuters could spot anything unusual. When evidence technicians brought recovered items back to the sterile environment of the crime lab, they found virtually nothing to test. Kraft meticulously removed wallets, military identification tags, and personal belongings from the young men to stall the notification of their families. He understood that delaying the identification process gave his trail time to grow completely cold. Without a name to anchor the investigation, detectives could not trace the final steps of the victims or establish a timeline of their disappearances. The lethal application of prescription sedatives further eliminated the presence of defensive wounds or the transfer of skin cells. Because his targets slipped into deep unconsciousness without a physical struggle, the laboratories found no foreign trace evidence under their fingernails. The lack of torn clothing or disrupted surroundings left the task force with a clinical, sterile aftermath. Detectives requested federal assistance to run the limited forensic data through national databases, only to receive blank responses week after week. The investigation stalled in these empty spaces, forcing exhausted officers to file away unsolved cases and return to patrolling the highways, while law enforcement agencies battled endless bureaucratic roadblocks. The families of the missing men endured a prolonged psychological nightmare. The victims were young men on the verge of claiming their adult lives, robbed of their futures in the passenger seat of a nondescript vehicle. In living rooms across the Midwest, mothers kept the bedrooms of their enlisted sons completely untouched, preserving their belongings like sacred relics. Fathers spent their weekends calling military bases and police stations, desperate for any administrative update regarding their missing boys. The families organized independent search parties, walking along the gravel shoulders of unfamiliar California roads with heavy hearts. They handed out flyers at local gas stations, speaking with clerks and truck drivers under the harsh glare of sodium streetlights. Krath systematically broke their hope by withholding the only thing that could bring them closure. The perpetrator kept the stolen identification cards and personal trinkets hidden away, creating a private collection of trophies in his home. He documented his grim achievements, quietly maintaining a secret inventory of the lives he extinguished. With every passing day of the late 1970s, the missing posters faded in the California sun. Yet the agonizing uncertainty for the families remained as sharp as ever. Investigators watched helplessly as the lists of missing persons grew longer, burdened by the knowledge that the predator remained deeply embedded in the community. They drove the highways every night, scanning the glowing taillights of passing cars, wondering which driver concealed the true horror of the region. The false professional facade constructed over a decade of deception shattered entirely during the early morning hours of May 14, 1983. At exactly 1:10 in the morning, 2 California Highway Patrol officers observed a brown Toyota Celica traveling northbound along the dark, sprawling stretch of Interstate 5 in Orange County. The vehicle wove erratic patterns across the dashed white lane dividers, drifting over the heavy rumble strips and creating a loud vibration in the crisp night air. The officers engaged their flashing emergency lights, signaling the swerving driver to pull over away from the flow of late-night traffic. The sedan rolled to a halt on the gravel shoulder, resting a mere 10 feet away from the towering concrete embankment of the overpass. 38-year-old Randy Kraft opened the heavy driver's side door and stepped out into the damp, salt-tinged coastal air with a sluggish demeanor. He discarded an empty glass beer bottle into the thick roadside brush, attempting to hide the evidence of his intoxication from the approaching authorities. The patrolman initiated a standard field sobriety test on the narrow, illuminated strip of asphalt positioned between the police cruiser and the stopped Toyota. Kraft stumbled through the examination, lost his footing on the uneven gravel, and completely failed the routine physical coordination assessment. The officers detained him against the side of his vehicle, expecting nothing more than a standard traffic citation for driving under the influence of alcohol. They possessed no idea this seemingly standard traffic intervention would rip the veil off a monumental tragedy hiding right under their noses. The crisp night air carried the deafening roar of passing commercial trucks, masking the true gravity of the moment unfolding on the roadside. The officers simply followed their standard operating procedures, acting with the mundane precision required by highway patrol protocols. They secured the impaired driver near the rear bumper of the car, preparing to inventory the vehicle before calling for a tow truck. With the uncooperative driver secured in handcuffs, one officer walked around the rear bumper to inspect the passenger side of the stopped vehicle. He aimed his heavy metal flashlight through the closed glass window, shining a powerful beam into the dark interior of the car. The harsh light cut through the shadows, illuminating the cramped front cabin and revealing a chilling scene frozen in time. 25-year-old Marine Terry Jambiel sat slumped heavily against the passenger door panel, completely unresponsive to the commotion happening outside the vehicle. A dark, thick jacket obscured the young man, covering his torso and broad shoulders to create the illusion of a sleeping passenger. The officer tapped his flashlight on the cold glass, receiving no response from the motionless figure resting in the passenger seat. He opened the heavy metal door to investigate further, immediately noting the terrifying absence of breathing or subtle physical movement. The patrolman reached out with his bare hand, feeling for a pulse along the exposed skin of the young Marine's neck. He found no heartbeat, confirming with absolute dread that the young man had already met a grim, permanent end inside the confined space. A faint, dark impression wrapped across the skin of his neck, indicating the application of lethal force before the traffic stop occurred. The officer backed away from the vehicle in a state of shock, drawing his service weapon and shouting urgent commands to his partner. The routine drunk driving intervention instantly transformed into an active, highly secure crime scene requiring immediate backup and forensic preservation. Additional police units flooded the desolate highway, sealing off the northbound lanes with an impenetrable perimeter of flashing red and blue lights. The invisible predator was finally trapped under the glaring high beams of police cruisers, ending a reign of terror that spanned over a decade. Crime scene investigators arrived at the cordoned-off highway and commenced a thorough inch-by-inch search of the secured Toyota Celica. They opened the rear trunk under the glow of portable halogen floodlights, cataloging every single object hidden within the carpeted storage compartment. Beneath a pile of mundane travel items and spare clothing, technicians unearthed a horrifying trove of physical evidence that defied logical comprehension. A standard leather briefcase contained a collection of chilling photographs depicting young men in incapacitated states scattered across different locations. The graphic images captured the precise moment these victims lost their futures, frozen forever in chemical unconsciousness by the hands of their captor. Yet, the most damning discovery of the entire investigation sat in plain sight on a sheet of yellow legal paper. The paper held a handwritten, heavily coded list containing 61 distinct entries scrawled in neat, deliberate penmanship across the lined page. The notations consisted of macabre nicknames like Iowa and definite somethings neatly aligned in vertical columns to track the unthinkable toll. Investigators stared at the fragile page, recognizing it as a personalized scorecard tracking a 12-year spree of unprecedented cruelty and calculation. Each cryptic line represented a stolen life, a ruined family, and an unsolved case file gathering dust in a county morgue waiting for an answer. The sheer volume of names listed on the single document left seasoned detectives standing on the side of the highway in absolute shock. The mild-mannered computer programmer had maintained a meticulous inventory of his grim achievements, treating human lives like lines of data in a ledger. The handwritten document laid bare the calculated, mechanical nature of his hidden life behind closed doors. The endless hunt for the phantom highway predator culminated in this single, devastating sheet of paper recovered from the trunk of a commuter car. Armed with the overwhelming evidence recovered from the vehicle, heavily equipped tactical units executed a midnight search warrant at the Long Beach residence. They breached the front door of the property, stepping into a perfectly nanicured suburban living room filled with modern furniture and domestic comforts. The home projected an unsettling aura of domestic tranquility, clashing violently with the horrific discoveries made on the gravel shoulder of the highway. Detectives dismantled the interior space room by room, tearing up floorboards and searching hidden wall compartments to uncover the full scope of the crimes. Deep inside the bedroom closets, they located a sprawling collection of personal belongings stripped from the missing travelers over the course of 12 years. Stacks of military identification cards, faded driver's licenses, and personal trinkets filled the shelves like prized trophies kept for private reflection. The names printed on the recovered cards matched the faces plastered on missing posters across 3 different states, confirming the worst fears of the community. Investigators cataloged the trophies one by one, linking the respected professional to over a decade of mysterious disappearances that had baffled regional authorities. The physical evidence bridged the massive geographical gaps that had hindered the original task forces connecting the dots between isolated drop sites. Law enforcement officers packed dozens of cardboard boxes with the stolen identities, emptying the suburban house of its dark hidden secrets. Neighbors stood on their lawns in the early morning light, watching the massive police presence dismantle their false sense of security in real time. The polite employed neighbor was unmasked as an apex predator operating in plain sight without anyone suspecting a thing. The reign of terror along the sun-drenched California freeways reached its definitive end, leaving behind a scarred community grappling with the unimaginable truth. The aftermath of the historic traffic stop triggered a sweeping, multi-state coordination effort spanning the entire western seaboard of the United States. Law enforcement agencies established a centralized command center in Orange County, finally breaking down the rigid administrative walls that kept jurisdictions isolated. Detectives pinned an enormous topographical map across the entire length of the precinct wall to track the movements of the suspect. They spent agonizing months matching the cryptic scorecard entries to unsolved cold cases across California, Oregon, and Michigan using the recovered trophies. Forensic specialists exhumed cold case files from dusty archives, retesting decades-old tissue samples using newly advanced toxicological screening methods available in the late 1980s. The chemical signatures of Ativan and Valium matched perfectly with the recovered remains of the young men left along the freeways. Investigators tracked Kraft through his historical commercial flight records, rental car receipts, and corporate expense reports filed during his business trips. They placed his physical location within miles of every single disappearance at the exact time the victims vanished from the highways. Task forces held extensive daily briefings, crossing off the coded nicknames on the yellow paper as they restored legal identities to the lost men. The relentless, unified police work transformed a sprawling, chaotic mystery into a concrete chain of irrefutable evidence ready for a court of law. Officers drove unmarked vehicles to the homes of the grieving families, delivering the devastating but definitive answers they had sought for over a decade. The immense bureaucratic failures of the past gave way to an overwhelming display of forensic unity that brought the predator to justice. In 1988, the formal judicial process commenced within the heavy oak walls of the Orange County Superior Court under intense public scrutiny. The proceedings evolved into one of the longest and most expensive criminal prosecutions in the history of California up to that point in time. The monumental trial consumed roughly 13 months of continuous hearings, testing the endurance of the legal system and the patience of the affected families. The prosecution presented an overwhelming mountain of indisputable forensic facts to the impaneled jury, leaving no room for alternate theories of the crimes. The district attorney called nearly 160 distinct witnesses to the wooden stand, ranging from expert toxicologists to former corporate colleagues of the defendant. Court clerks wheeled in heavy metal carts containing more than 1,000 pieces of physical and photographic evidence collected from the vehicle and the home. The defense attorneys attempted to suppress the contents of the vehicle search, arguing procedural technicalities regarding the initial traffic stop on the highway. The presiding judge denied the legal motion, allowing the jury to see the horrifying contents of the leather briefcase and the handwritten scorecard. The families of the victims occupied the gallery benches every single day, sitting just 15 feet away from the man who stole their sons. They maintained a dignified silence, bearing witness to the public dismantling of his professional facade as the state laid out the timeline of his actions. The overwhelming toxicological data presented by medical examiners left no room for reasonable doubt regarding his absolute culpability in the disappearances. The prosecutor connected every single legal pad entry to a grieving family sitting in the courtroom, humanizing the victims for the attentive jury. The sheer weight of the forensic presentation crushed any defense attempt to paint the defendant as an innocent bystander caught in a misunderstanding. On August 11, 1989, the courtroom fell into total heavy silence as the jury foreman stood to deliver the anticipated verdict. The jury convicted Prath of 16 counts of first-degree capital offenses, confirming his status as a methodical predator in the eyes of the law. The legal conclusion vindicated the years of agonizing uncertainty endured by the families of the young servicemen and innocent travelers who trusted the wrong driver. Several months later, on November 29, 1989, the final phase of the exhaustive judicial process reached its dramatic climax before the court. Judge Donald A. McCartan sat high above the wooden gallery, looking down at the defense table with an expression of stern authority. He delivered a blistering verbal assessment of the calculated cruelty inflicted upon the trusting victims over the course of the 12-year spree. The judge formally sentenced the defendant to death, securing the highest possible penalty under state law to ensure he would never walk free again. The heavy strike of the wooden gavel echoed through the quiet chamber, bringing a measure of definitive legal closure to the assembled families holding hands. The rigid justice system functioned exactly as intended, stripping away his freedom permanently and removing the threat from the vulnerable public. The conviction validated the countless hours of invisible labor performed by the dedicated task force detectives who refused to let the cases remain cold. Mothers and fathers walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, clutching the faded photographs of their beloved sons tight against their chests. The absolute triumph of moral order provided a profound sense of satisfaction to the shattered community seeking retribution for the massive loss of life. Following his definitive sentencing, the convicted man spent over 3 decades confined to the notorious death row at San Quentin State Prison. He lived inside a tiny concrete cell, isolated from the sprawling, sun-baked highways he once dominated with absolute authority. In the year 2026, amid a broader statewide dismantling of death row facilities, authorities transferred him to the California Institution for Men in Chino. He remains permanently incarcerated within those high-security walls today, existing as a forgotten relic of a bygone era of transient vulnerability. While many cryptic entries on the handwritten scorecard could never be linked to physical remains, the pursuit of justice by law enforcement never stopped. Dedicated cold case investigators continue to identify likely victims even decades after the original trial concluded in the late 1980s. By applying sophisticated genetic genealogy during the years 2023 as well as 2024, researchers discovered further remains connected to the offender in California and Oregon. The incredible technological advancements allow modern detectives to finish the crucial work started by the original highway patrolman on that fateful May night. The sheer volume of his documented crimes permanently altered the cultural landscape of the region, destroying the inherent trust of the entire era. Hitchhiking vanished entirely from the sun-drenched on ramps of the Pacific Coast, replaced by a lingering sense of caution and a heightened